upside. All right. Okay. Today's Talmud, we've been consistently now for the last month or so. We've been consistently for the last month or so. We've been studying from the tractate Sanhedrin, and chapter 11, which is known as Perek Chelek. Chapter Chelek, which is not as technical as other parts of the Talmud. It's not as legal or technical. It's what's called Agadah, a lot of different lessons and messages based on stories and ideas. And a big section, actually, of what's spoken about in this chapter, which we're not focusing on really, is the discussion of what's called the era of Mashiach, when Mashiach is going to come, and should we calculate what's called the Ketz, the end of time, or not, or the great Armageddon, the war of Gog and Magog. So there's a lot of that, and I'm skipping it because it's very long. But if you are interested in that, I encourage you to read up on your own. So it's Sanhedrin, page 96, 97. That's the section which you can follow up on your own if you'd like. We are doing Sanhedrin, but I'm going to be skipping around and going in order, but not going in direct order. So if you are following along with me, we are on 96A. 96A in the middle of the page. And the title which I sent out for today's class was Righteous People with Wicked Parents. And in history, we have some very interesting examples of that. I don't say that loosely because we don't typically describe anyone as wicked. But then there are some people in history who clearly were wicked. And yet we find that some of them, even some of those who were very clearly wicked people, nonetheless merited to have righteous, whether it's children or grandchildren. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. There's actually the names of those people we're going to get to. That's actually a very short section of the Talmud. But beforehand, there's a very interesting question which the Talmud is going to address, which is, if there is someone who is righteous, whose parent or whose grandparent is wicked or was wicked, should you even mention it? Should you bring it up? It would seem to be that all you're accomplishing is shaming someone. So why would the Talmud even get into this discussion? Why would the Talmud get into certain people who were righteous, but they had wicked grandparents? It seems to just be a negative thing to talk about and a offensive thing to talk about. So that's the opening. The Talmud first addresses why it's worth mentioning, and then we'll get into who it was that was wicked and nonetheless had righteous offspring, righteous descendants. So here's what the Gemara says. And again, it's 96a, right in the middle of the page. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Zera says as follows, and he shares the following. And there's actually a very beautiful point over here. Amar Rabbi Zera said like this. Afal Gav, despite the fact that we have the following statement, the Shalach Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and some people say it wasn't Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira who sent this message, but rather Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. All right, so disagreement as to who said the following message. But here was the message. This person said, there are three things you should be careful about. Hizaru, three things to be careful about. The first is, Hizaharu, be careful about the kvodoi shel zaken. Be careful about the honor of an older person. Sheshachach talmudo machmas ansa. There's an elderly person who has forgotten their wisdom because of illness. Machmas ansa. Ansa means by no fault of their own. It's not as if they've slacked off. But unfortunately, today we know all too well that there's many situations in which someone gets older, and whether it's a form of dementia or Alzheimer's, and there's many, it's interesting, one of the blessings that we have in the world nowadays is longevity. We know how to keep people alive longer than perhaps we used to. Like the lifespan, the life expectancy now, today is probably, 20 years longer than it was 100 years ago. I don't know, maybe somebody here has more accurate numbers, but the life expectancy is a lot longer now than it used to be. And that's a blessing, but it also includes sometimes a curse, because you could have people, I mean, who am I to say if it's a curse? We're saying sometimes the longevity a lot causes, there's many more cases of people who are dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's. So the Talmud is really sharing a beautiful idea. Be very careful about the honor of someone who has forgotten their wisdom because of illness. And it's easier said than done. And it's easier said than done, because you almost have to look at the person and not see them for what they are right now, but really see them for what they were, because their accomplishments remain. You know, the wisdom they built up, and the wisdom and the goodness and the good deeds, really they deserve as much as a person who is fully functional, because they still have in their, so to say, in their account all of the good that they've done. So, but it's easy to forget that, because you look at a person and perhaps, depending on the actual scenario, they could be extremely, what's the word? They could really lack any ability. But be very careful. Why? So an interesting thing, and if I find this often, that I prepare Gemara, and then somehow within the Gemara, you come across ideas which are related to the Torah portion. So the reason which is brought down is that we find that the Torah took the broken tablets. This week's Torah portion, we read about the broken tablets. And what happened with the broken tablets? What's the conclusion? So Moshe breaks the tablets at the end, and then God says, okay, now you need new tablets. So he goes up the mountain, brings new stones, and there's a second set of tablets. But whatever happens to the broken pieces of the tablets? They're put in the ark alongside the complete tablets, even though they're broken and therefore unlegible. You can't use them. What are the value of broken tablets? But because once upon a time they contained the clear writing of the Ten Commandments, the holiest, the holy words of Torah, even though now they're broken, they still belong in the ark.
Aren't they more important than the first and the second one? Somehow more miraculous or something like that?
You're suggesting they're more important. On a basic level, no.
More important, but I think there was some kind
right. There's some sort of, yeah.
We didn't get those.
Right. And if you would have, there was some, well, the first tablets were greater than the second in the sense that they were the handwork of God. They were carved out by God. The second tablets, God says to Moshe, it's all this week's parsha. Psalacha, you have to carve it out, and then I'll write, you carve out the stones, bring them up, and I'll put in the writing. So in that sense, potentially they were greater. In other words, that they were the actual handwork of God start to finish. The second set of tablets were not. Only the writing was, the actual carving of the stone was Moshe. But on a simple level, the first ones were broken. You couldn't read them anymore. And it's a very, if you think about what the Gemara saying, it's a very beautiful analogy. He's saying that someone who studied a lot of Torah, or who accomplished great deeds, and now is no longer able to remember, or perhaps is an invalid, you have to see them like the broken luchos. They were there. The broken luchos didn't break themselves. They were broken because of something not by their fault, and they're placed in the holy ark.
It's almost like the generation that was killed in the desert.
Right, but that's different. That generation in the desert, they did things wrong. They were punished for their sins. No, but that's an important difference. Is that over here, the person who lost their knowledge didn't do anything wrong. That's why the comparison is to the broken stones. They didn't do anything wrong. They were suffering from the sin of the Jewish people. Anyway, it's something beautiful to think about, especially for those of us, and I'm sure most of us know someone or even very close to someone like that, is to remember to look at them with the holiness of what they've accomplished in the past, and the fact that the luchos were placed in the Holy of Holies, even though they were broken, is a beautiful idea to remember when coming across such a person. So the first idea was honor those who, even if right now they don't seem to have the qualities, but they accomplished it and then they lost it by no fault of their own. Show them the honor as if they had it. The second thing he said is a very technical issue, and that is v'hizoharu bivridin. Be careful about the the veins, or when the process of slaughtering a bird is somewhat complex, or Kadas Rabbi Yehuda, he says, be very careful in the process of slaughtering a bird, because apparently in some ways people will overlook the process of slaughtering a bird more so than they would the slaughtering of an animal. That's number two. And the third thing is V'hizaharu b'kvod b'nei amei haaretz. Furthermore, the third thing is be very careful when showing honor to children of people, to those who are scholars, those who have accomplished a lot, but they're descendants of Amma Aretz, those who are ignoramuses. And be very careful, because there's certain sensitivity to their past. Now, there's people who have a checkered past or checkered lineage, and now they have accomplished a lot. They've done good things. When I say accomplished a lot, I don't mean they've made a lot of money, but they've done a lot of good, and they've studied a lot of Torah. Be careful in showing them respect, because such people could be extra sensitive when you bring up their past. You say, who are you to who are you to be a great leader, a rabbi? Where do you come from? So be very careful about that. Shemante to Torah, because these people are bringing Torah to the masses. And obviously, we could even argue that someone who comes from a past which is not an illustrious lineage, and yet nonetheless is able to break through and study Torah and become a Torah scholar, they deserve even more credit. But he said you should be sensitive to them and make sure to show them proper respect. He said, nonetheless, even though you have to be sensitive, like we said, sensitive to a person who gained wisdom and lost it by no fault of his own, and also sensitive to those who have whose lineage is from a checkered past, you have to show them sensitivity. Nonetheless, there is value in sharing the following idea, which again emphasizes how someone wicked can nonetheless be the parent or grandparent or great-grandparent of holiness, of someone who's very holy. And the question is how? How could someone righteous come from someone who is wicked? How is that possible? So on a simple level, you could say, well, it's possible that everyone has freedom of choice. So just because someone's great-grandparents are wicked, that doesn't mean they have to be that way, right? And we have interesting examples of this. Even in today's day and age, I've heard, I can't say I've met anyone firsthand, but I've heard that there are people out there who are descendants of people who were in World War II or Nazis. And yet, today, there exists people who have converted to Judaism, who may be the child or grandchild of someone who was a Nazi. And in our vocabulary, the idea of a Nazi is perhaps the most evil possibility of recent history. And yet you have people today who are righteous, religious Jews who are descendants of those people. So where does it come from? So here the Talmud gives an interesting answer. So you could say, well, it has nothing to do with their parents, nothing to do with their grandparents. They chose to do their own thing, and they chose the right path, even though their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents were perhaps wicked people. Yes?
So when you're talking wicked, are you talking about like at a conscious level immoral, or like not keeping code? Like
That's why I started by saying wicked. That's why I'm giving an example of a Nazi.
Okay.
I'm not talking about people who we judge. We're all imperfect.
Yeah.
We're talking about Rishaim, people who everyone would agree this was a very bad person. Yeah. We're not talking about simply people who struggle with certain areas of fulfillment of Torah. We're talking about bad people. And you'll see the examples. Yes. If you're an Amaleki, you're not allowed to join Klal Yisrael. That's true, but that's an Amaleki. Not necessarily. We could have there's some technical laws about who can and can't convert, but there could be a wicked person who doesn't fit into that category. There's another point, which is that nowadays we don't know any of that. We don't have clarity of who belongs to which nation. So therefore, many of those areas of prohibition don't continue on a practical level. Okay, with that in mind, now that the Talmud prefaced that there's a reason why we want to share this, even though it could come across as insensitive. What is the reason? The reason is the Talmud saying that it could very well be that that even someone who is known to be a wicked person, like we said, wicked, bad, but at some point in their life they did something righteous. Even the most horrible people, at some point, you hear these stories. Someone who we know to be a terrible, wicked person, and yet at some point in their life they did something righteous. And that righteous act they did, it didn't change them because they're too far gone. But that can express itself in a righteous grandchild or great-grandchild several generations later. That it's their act of righteousness which began the process that they merited because of that to have a For them, it didn't help. You know, this little there's the joke about a guy, a terrible miser who comes to heaven, and just a bad person. They come to heaven, they have to decide this person goes to heaven or, God forbid, to Gehenna, to hell. So they have to decide what's going to be. So it seems to be pretty clear this person is destined for Gehenna. He's done nothing right in his life. Then, as they're about to issue the verdict, a compassionate angel steps up and says, wait a second, one dime. This person was walking down the street, and there happened to be a homeless person there in the corner. And even though this went contrary to his pattern throughout his entire life, he reached into his pocket, took out a quarter, and gave it to the poor person, to the homeless person. So the angel says, how can you throw him into Gehenna? When after all, there was a quarter that he gave to charity, just goodness. So yeah, it wasn't most of his life. How can you throw that person into Gehenna? So there's uproar in heaven. What do we do about this person? He did so many terrible things, but he didn't give that quarter to the homeless person. How do we resolve this issue? Nobody can resolve it. Finally, it comes all the way to the decision. And God makes a decision. What's going to be the ruling for this person? And the ruling comes out. Give him his quarter back and let him go to hell. So you have people like this who are wicked people, but they did one righteous act. So unlike that joke, in which it sounds like that righteous act has no significance on their life, the Talmud says no. It could play itself out generations later with a righteous descendant because of that one act they did. Yeah.
Why is it that because somebody's wicked, their kids are automatically assumed that they will be? If we have free choice.
Why is it that someone wicked, their children are soon to be wicked? I think it's a good question. I think that's not what the Gemara is saying. The Gemara is saying that for someone to have a descendant who's not just okay, but like a righteous person, like a tzaddik, someone that descendant is not just okay. You're right. A wicked person, the children of wicked people are not going to be wicked. They have freedom of choice. But it's almost as if for someone to have descendants which are truly righteous, and in these cases, often it meant someone who converted to Judaism, then there has to be some level of siyata d'shmaya. There has to be some divine assistance to that.
We're talking about all wicked people are not Jews.
The examples that are going to be brought here are not Jews to begin with. Yes, correct.
So is it not possible to have a Jewish wicked person?
Yeah, sure, you can. But the examples the Talmud here is talking about, you'll see, are not Jewish people. So here is the Talmud now goes into the concept that a single act that you do, even if it's one act of goodness among many acts of wickedness, it can have a very significant positive consequence. And we're going to talk about one of the great wicked people in the history of the Jews. You know, when we think of history, we think of wicked people. We think of names like Stalin or Hitler or this. But if you go back in history, we have others like that who caused terrible devastation to Jewish people. And one of them was a man named Nebuchadnezzar, who was the one who destroyed the first temple and destroyed Jerusalem and killed untold amounts of people. So the Gemara says, who was the prophet of that era? The prophet of destruction was the prophet Jeremiah. So the Gemara says, Jeremiah asked, Tzadik Hashem ki orev alachach mishpatim adaber oischa. We're quoting now from Jeremiah, chapter 12, verse number 1 and 2, which Jeremiah says, God, I know that you are righteous and I know that you are just, but I am going to challenge you to explain to me. I believe you're just, but I challenge you to explain to me your ways. Madua derech risha'im tzleicha. Why is it that the path of wicked people, we find sometimes that wicked people are successful? Doesn't make any sense. How is it that a wicked person could find any success? Those who revolt against you, somehow we find that they have success. He says, I don't get it. I don't get how wicked people could have success. In other verses in the Tatum, Gam Shirashu Yehu Gam Osuperi, and we find that they are fruitful in their efforts. Umaya Hadrule, and he says, what did God respond to him? So the Gemara gives a lengthy analogy in which God responds. But the simple answer he says is that Nebuchadnezzar has success. Nebuchadnezzar was a wicked person, has success. Why? Because he took 4 steps in my honor. God says he took 4 steps for my honor, and because of those 4 steps, he has success. Now, if we take in the full picture, the destruction of the first temple, the Talmud elsewhere says, was because of our mistakes, because of the sins of the Jewish people. It says about both temples. Temples were destroyed for the sins of the Jewish people. But nonetheless, Yirmiyahu is basically saying, okay, temple has to be destroyed. And that I believe is because of the Jewish people's mistakes. But why is it that Nebuchadnezzar merited, so to say, to have success in his campaign against the Jewish people? Let it be someone else. Nebuchadnezzar was a wicked person. Again, that's important to emphasize. It wasn't as if the Jerusalem was destroyed because Nebuchadnezzar was powerful. Jerusalem was destroyed because the Jewish people, God decided deserved for it to be destroyed. But his question is nonetheless, why was it Nebuchadnezzar who was successful in this campaign? What did he do? And his answer is, God's answer is that even though he was a wicked person, but he did something right, and that good thing he did led to great merit for him. And obviously the reason the Gemara is bringing this down is to tell us a very important point, and that is that every act has to be judged on its own merit. So in other words, we don't say that a good thing that someone does, even if they are generally speaking not a good person, but that good act that they do can merit a tremendous reward. Not just any reward, can merit tremendous positive outcome. So therefore God says, even someone as wicked as Nebuchadnezzar, because he took 4 steps in my honor, therefore he merited great success. And then the Gemara says, what 4 steps? What are the 4 steps? So it says like this. Here is the story behind the 4 steps. Nebuchadnezzar, one of the great generals of history, the 4 steps that he took out of respect for God. What's the story? So this goes back to the following. There was one of the righteous kings of the Jewish people. For those of you who are familiar with Tanakh, so you have the great divide between the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, right? You have the 2 tribes led by Judah, and that's where one kingdom, that's called the kingdom of Judah. And then you have the 10 tribes to split off from them, and that becomes the 10 tribes of Israel. The 10 tribes of Israel, the kings were generally speaking unholy and idolatrous. Among the 2 tribes, which was King David's lineage, there we have kind of a back and forth between holy kings and unholy kings, righteous kings and wicked kings. And often it was a father, son. The father was righteous, the son was wicked. The next generation, righteous, wicked. Okay. One of these back and forths was a wicked king whose name was Achaz. Achaz was wicked. And his son was one of the great righteous kings whose name was Chizkiah. So Achaz was wicked, Chizkiah was righteous. Fine. That's a little bit of context for what happens next. The Gemara says, the Amar of Yochanan says, the day that Achaz died, the king Achaz, who was wicked, the day that Achaz died, there was a miraculous event that took place. There was only 2 hours of sunlight. In other words, God removed 10 hours of sunlight from the day and left only 2 hours of sunlight. Why? So there's 2 opinions as to why. One is, so that they would have to bury him quickly without any honor. There's no sunlight. Today, without sunlight, you still have electricity. But in those days, you were, as far as light was concerned, especially out in the public, you were dependent on the light of the sun. So there's no sunlight, caused that they didn't have, Judaism certainly follows a tradition, we bury right away. So a day with no sunlight, they have to bury him quickly. There's no chance to give great honor. So therefore God caused that this wicked king would not have any great honor because he was wicked. It's only 2 hours of sunlight. Another opinion, which is brought on the Marsha, was that it was a form of penitence. That if this person wouldn't be given a proper honorable burial, it would be one form of penitence for his ways. Fine. So that's what happened when Achaz died. His son Chizkiah was a righteous king. Chala, when Chizkiah, we have the famous episode in which Chizkiah becomes very sick. They thought he would die, but then he was healed. Chala Chizkiah v'isbach. He was sick and he became healed. Ahadrinu kutshabrichu lahana chasar. So then God returned the 10 missing hours. So the day that Chizkiah was healed, God caused this miracle to happen, that the clock, so to say, the sun stood still, and 10 hours were given back. The 10 hours which were lost by his father were given back to Chizkiah. And he quotes a pasuk that speaks about this. Pasuk in Yeshaya, if you want to follow up, chapter 38, verse number 8. So this is what happens. Chizkiah, this miracle happens. Chizkiah is healed, and a day suddenly lasts an extra 8 hours. Now, right next to Israel is the whole region. So if there's 8 hours of extra day in Israel, there's 8 hours of extra day in the region too. So the nations nearby were wondering, what's going on? Why is today lasting an extra 8 hours? Talk about daylight savings. I mean, this is a whole new level. Fall back 8 hours. So at that point, the king, the king of Babel, the king of Babylonia, which is again modern day Iraq around, was a man named Baladan. He was actually known as Baladan ben Baladan, Baladan the son of Baladan. And he said to his servants, Amar Lahu, Baladan said to his servants, my high, what's going on? My high means is in Aramaic for what's this? What's going on? Amrule. So they responded to him. His servants responded that this is because of the king of the Jewish people, Chizkiyahu. Chalash v'itfach. He was sick and now is better. And therefore, as a miracle, God is granting him an extra 10 hours today. Now that he's been healed, God is giving back some time that he lost because of his illness. Fine. Omar, the king hears this. Baladan hears this. He says, Ika Gavra ki hai. There's such a exceptional person that God shows such favoritism towards. Velo ba'inon l'shador l'shlama. And I'm not going to send him a message. I owe him a postcard. He says, if this is such a righteous person right next door among the Jewish people, I have to send him my acknowledgement of this great moment and tell him, show my reverence for him. And therefore, Baladan, the king, said, Kisle, I'd like you to write a lesson to him, write a message to him. And this is what you should write. In the letter, you should write the following. Shlama l'malcha Chizkiah. Shlama means shalom, peace to King Chizkiah. Shalom l'karta d'Yerushalayim. Peace to the city of Jerusalem. Shalom le'elakad Rabbah, and peace to the great God. That's how he dictated the letter to be written to Chizkiah, to the king of the Jewish people. At that point, says the Gemara, this is by whom? Who says this? Baladan, the king Baladan. At that point, Nebuchadnezzar was Safrei de Baladan. This is before Nebuchadnezzar became the king of Babel. At that point, his role was that he was the Safrei. What is the Safrei? Like the Sofer, the scribe. He was the scribe of King Baladan. He was a scribe of it. And when Baladan was dictating the letter to be written to Chizkiah, Nebuchadnezzar happened to not be there at the moment. He was the scribe, but he was, it was his day off or something. Ki asa, but when he came back to the palace and heard about this whole ordeal, Amar lahu, he said to the substitute scribe who had stepped in for him that while he was gone, Heche kasvisu. What exactly did you write when you sent this message to Chizkiah? Amrule. So they said to him, Hachi kasvina. He said, that's how he wrote, exactly as Baladan had commanded us. Peace to King Chizkiah, peace to the city of Jerusalem, peace to the great God of the Jewish people. He says, that's what he wrote. Amrulahu, to which point Nebuchadnezzar, again, the future king, future destroyer of Jerusalem, said to them, Karisuluhu elokarab. You, in your letter, you refer to their God as the great God. Vikasvisulu basov. And you wrote it at the end of the description. You start by saying peace to Chizkiah. Then you say peace to Jerusalem. And then you say peace to God. Omar, he said, no, that's not the way to do it. If you're calling it a great God, you must reverse it. And you have to start by saying Shleim Lalukaraba. You have to start by saying peace to the great God. Shlam Katu Shleim. And then move on to the peace to the city of Jerusalem. And only afterwards, Shlam Lamalka Chizkiah. After you mention peace to God and peace to the city of Jerusalem, then you can say peace to the king Chizkiah. Amrule. So they said to him, this was Nebuchadnezzar, then just at that point, just describe. They said to him the following line, which is a line which is used, Kraina de Igrisa, Ihu lehave parvanka. The one who knows the letter should be the one to write the letter. If that's what you feel, if you feel that we have to edit the letter, then go ahead and do so. This is your this is your opinion. You have your own editing. It's like, this is like there's in Judaism we have the guy who always gives eitzes. Eitzes means advice. The person who has all perfect advice about how to do things and how to make the food and how to do it. But when it comes to actually doing anything, they take a step back. No, that's not me. I'm just here to give advice. I'll correct your whatever it is that you do. I'll give all the corrections I need. Then I'll go home and just go to sleep. So in Yiddish, there's a response. The Kraina Digger said, you want to give corrections, then do it. Don't just give advice. And that's what they said to him. If you have advice on how the letter should be written, then go ahead. Then change the letter. We have it written the way our king told us to do. At this point, when he heard that, it says, Rahat Basre, he ran after the person, the emissary who was going to bring the letter to Chizkiah. And he took 4 big steps to catch up to the person who was sending the letter, to be able to correct it, to say, instead of putting Shalom Lalakar Rabba, peace to the great God at the end of the letter, to move it to the front of the letter. And he jumped 4 steps to catch that person. At that point, says the Gemara, Asa Gavriel v'ukne. At that point, the angel Gavriel came. So this mystical idea. The angel Gavriel came and brought that emissary back. The angel didn't want Nebuchadnezzar taking any more steps to reach this person. Why not? Because the angel understood that what was taking place over here would have grave consequence to the Jewish people. In other words, that each step Nebuchadnezzar was taking was strengthening, because these were steps being done out of respect for God. And for whatever reason, those steps were going to give Nebuchadnezzar great success. He said, I'd rather stop him from taking more steps. And therefore, it says the angel came and stopped the emissary so that Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't take any more steps. But the bottom line is those 4 steps that Nebuchadnezzar took were allowed him to achieve, which God saw as being acts of great respect for God Almighty. Those allowed him to achieve the success that he achieved later, which is again, it's hard to understand. It's hard to understand how 4 steps can, but what it does say is that even a terrible person, if they do something righteous, they can have that righteous act can have a great impact, not only in the moment, but even in future history. I've once heard this idea in the context of that there's a tradition, many people don't know this, that when the Torah is lifted, right? At the end of the service, we lift the Torah. Sephardi communities lift the Torah in the beginning, but then as the Torah is being brought back to the ark, what is the tradition? We kiss, we stand by the Torah and give it a kiss, which is nice. But the truth is, a greater act of respect for the Torah than giving it a kiss is to actually walk alongside the Torah or follow it. Following it shows that I'm escorting the Torah. And I once heard it in the context of this, that if you see Nebuchadnezzar was rewarded for the 4 steps that he took out of respect for God, so then when you take steps and you follow the Torah towards the ark, you're so to say combating the respect that Nebuchadnezzar did, and you should show. So if Nebuchadnezzar was a wicked person, had that type of respect to take 4 steps out of respect for God, then for sure we should also show that kind of respect and take a few steps as the Torah is being escorted back to the ark. And Rabbi Yochanan concludes to say, had Gavriel not stopped him, then it would have caused, and he would have taken more steps, then the damage he caused later to Jerusalem could have been even more so. It could have been much more devastating. Okay, so the whole point of the story is, aside to share an interesting episode that took place, is to go back to the point that if you see someone who descends from a very wicked person and seems to be is a righteous person, you could say, well, this is nothing to do with the actions of his great-great-grandfather. Or you could say, no, maybe the great-great-grandfather did something, even though he lived a wicked life, but at some point did something righteous, and therefore he didn't see the blessing of it, but because of that, it led to having a very righteous descendant. Who are some of the examples of people who were wicked and yet had righteous descendants. So now I'm going to jump a little bit to page Tzadik Vav on Beis 96b. And here's what the Gemara says. Tan Rabbanan, what are examples of people who were wicked and nevertheless had righteous offspring? So this Gemara comes in the immediate aftermath of the previous Gemara, which talks about perhaps the most surprising, maybe the word should be uncomfortable, convert in our history. We think of conversion, people who convert. When we talk about someone converting, perhaps the most, again, I'm not sure how to say this, but the most uncomfortable conversion story in history is the previous Gemara, where it talks about someone who can only be described as a human butcher, a man whose name was Nebuzradan. Nebuzradan was the executioner for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a general who conquered Jerusalem and destroyed it, and he had an executioner named Nebuzradan. And in a rather horrific story, the Talmud says Nebuzradan came to the temple after it was conquered and after it was set aflame. And Nebuzradan saw blood on the floor. And he asked, who does this blood belong to? And they said, maybe it's an animal, because this was a temple, there were sacrifices brought. And he slaughtered an animal. He said, no, the blood does not match. This is not the blood of an animal. This is the blood of a human being. And they said, so he found out further. They asked, who was it? And he says, this is the blood of the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah was a prophet who was killed by Jews. Why was Zechariah killed by Jews? Because he prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem. And the Jews were not, you ever hear the famous line, don't kill the messenger? So it's quite literally a case where they killed the messenger. Zechariah prophesied that the destruction of the temple was going to happen. Jerusalem would be destroyed. And the people, out of their anger for the message, killed the messenger. And they killed Zechariah. And his blood was still there. It says boiling on the floor of the temple. So Nebuzradan saw this. And he concluded this is the blood of a Jewish prophet. And without going into the details, if you want, you can. You can check this out, Sanhedrin 96b. Nebuzradan says, I am going to mifayasnale, which means I will satiate this blood. I will appease this blood. And how did he appease the blood? By killing. He says, I will kill people until the blood is appeased. The blood stops boiling, bubbling. And it says, Talmud says he killed many, many people. And the blood of Zechariah continued to move, to bubble. And he couldn't, and again, the story is, it's horrible when you read it. But then he says to, he so to say announced, he says, Zechariah. This is what Nebuzradan said. Zechariah. Tovim shebehem ibadatim. I already killed so many of the good of the Jewish people. Do you want me to kill them all? Is that what you're waiting for? And when he said that, says the Gemara, miyad nach. At that point, the blood stopped flowing. And it was that statement calmed the blood of Zechariah. At that point, says the Gemara, here tshuva bedaite. At that point, it was rather than had a thought of repentance in his mind. And he said, Omar, he had the following calculation. He said, Mahem, if the Jewish people, Shelo ibdu ela nefesh achas, the Jewish people killed one person, they killed Zechariah. And as a result, this was his calculation. As a result, the entire Jerusalem was destroyed and all the people were killed, however many were killed. He says, Hahu Gavra, he spoke, if I myself, who killed so many people, what's going to happen to me? He says, they killed one person and the result was this type of destruction. I can only imagine what awaits me. And that thought process, it says, led to Arak. Arak means, not like the whiskey Arak. Arak means he ran away. Arak means he ran away. Shadar Purtisila Bese. and he sent a will to his family, his last will and testament, so to say, as if to say, I'm no longer existent. The Isgayer, and he converted. So the same person who previously was killing Jews. I mean, there was really no simpler, easier description, better, no more accurate description saying than like a Nazi killer, someone who was part of an extermination of the Jews, but had a thought of repentance and actually converted. It really doesn't make sense. You're right. It doesn't make sense in the way we understand these things. And I once remember reading I didn't read this. I heard this in a Torah shir I was listening to, how in maybe the 1950s or 60s, there was a person who wrote a book on the topic of conversion. And in the topic of conversion, and he said that we had a case that came to our attention. I guess he was in Israel, and it was part of one of the issues the rabbis deal with is conversion. He says a case came before us in which a person wanted to convert, and over the course of the discussions, he revealed that he was, I don't know to what degree, but he was part of the German army in World War II. I don't know if he was one of the actual Nazis, and he was there. And now he was standing in front of us in our Jewish court saying, I want to convert. And the rabbi said like this, he said it was, I don't know if he spelled out what ended up happening, whether they did go through the conversion or not. He says, but what's interesting is that according to Jewish law, there's no law which forbids such a person from converting. Now, the Beis Din may say, we don't trust that this person is good, and therefore we're not going to go through the conversion. Every Beis Din has the right to say that. Every court has the right to say, we don't trust in this person's good intent, and therefore we're not comfortable converting such a person. Anyone can say that. But according to Jewish law, there is nothing stopping a person who is exceptionally wicked from saying, I want to become a new person. That's how radical Judaism is in our belief in a person becoming a new person. Now, it doesn't take away from the fact that a person has to be punished for their actions. That's something else. It's almost like a separate point, that a person deserves punishment for their behavior for sure. But Judaism has a very radical approach in this regard, that a person's past behavior has no, even as horrible as it is, a person can always change and become a better person. Again, they still have to face the consequences of what they've done. If a person committed murder, the Jewish response to that may be capital punishment. But that's a punishment what they've done. But there's never a point where a person cannot say, I'm ready to become a better person. Yes?
And once they convert, if they're completely accepted, so to say, and they convert, are they still susceptible to those?
Yes, even if they've converted, but nevertheless, they're punished for their crimes. I get that, but nonetheless, so but that's more of a spiritual idea that conversion brings about like a new soul. But nonetheless, the crimes of the past, if a person steals and then they convert, they have to pay back what they stole. There's two different, it's almost like there's two calculations that take place. One is the calculation of where God can judge that this person now has had a change of heart and now is righteous. But being righteous right now doesn't mean I don't have to pay for the sins of my past. Two separate things. And God says, I see a righteous person. They've done tshuva, they are righteous. But from a standpoint of justice in this world, justice is paid based on, I mean, let me ask you this question. Let me ask you this question. What if someone, even in our court system, what if someone is brought to court for a crime they committed? And let's say it's murder. Let's just use a very drastic example. This person committed murder. And now this person stands in front of the courts, and everyone can see this person is a good person right now. That they've changed their ways. Every psychiatrist and psychologist comes in and says, you're standing in front of you is a good person. So should they not be punished for their act? Because even in our system, we understand that maybe you are righteous right now, but at the end of the day, you've got to. There's justice has to be paid. Doesn't matter. So maybe they have to face capital punishment. So but this person, it's not a contradiction to say they have to be punished for their crime, as severe as it is. But nonetheless, when they come and say, I want right now to be a different person than I was in the past, Judaism says that's very well possible, regardless to how terrible the past was. Yes.
My whole thing is what if they're just using it as an escape to try to, and they're just condescending and being blind?
Absolutely. And you're right. And that's why I think it's very unlikely. Practically speaking, it's very unlikely that someone who committed a horrible crime would be accepted, would be accepted back or accepted as in a form of conversion, especially if the crime was against Jews. But that's because you're right. That's between human beings. But as far as God is concerned, God who knows what's inside a person's heart, it really can't. A person can absolutely change, as horrible as their past is, and as much as they have to pay for their past. That doesn't hinder them from changing and right now embracing a brand new future.
We don't have to live
All right. Okay, so let's go on. What are some of the examples? We have to get to the point of who are some of the examples in history who were wicked, nonetheless had righteous descendants. So says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanan, here are some examples of those. Some will be more familiar to you, some less familiar. The first is Naaman. Naaman, who himself was a general of King Aram in the times of Elisha. Elisha was the disciple of Eliyahu Hanavi. So you have Elijah the prophet, who was succeeded by Elisha. And at that point, there was a king who waged war against the Jewish people. You can read about it in the book of Melachim, book of Kings, Kings 2, chapter 5. And the general was a man named Naaman, a general waging war against the Jewish people. Eventually, he became a ger toshav. What is a ger toshav? So this is an interesting point, there's a ger means a convert. But if you look in Torah terminology, there's two types of converts. There's a ger toshav and a ger tzedek. A ger toshav means a Gentile who says, I am accepting upon myself the full observance of the 7 Noachite commandments. Belief in God, do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not harm animals. So that's called a ger toshav. I'm not Jewish. I don't intend to be Jewish, but I am a righteous Gentile. So this person who was wicked changed his course of path, and he became a ger toshav. He accepted upon himself. So that's one example.
I think ger toshav was someone who lived in Israel but also had that.
Correct.
that status.
But yeah, right. Someone who joins the land of Israel and lives in such a way. Yeah, you're right. Correct. Nivuzradan, the general we just spoke about. Ger Tzedekai, the general who was the executioner for Nebuchadnezzar, became a ger tzedek, a full-fledged convert. He accepted upon himself, in other words, he accepted upon himself the entire Torah, full observance of Torah. The next one is Mibnei Banav Shal Sisra, from the descendants of Sisra. Sisra was the king, was again the general of one of the kings of Canaan, going way back to the times of the Shoftim. You could follow up on this in the book of Shoftim, Judges chapter 4, pasuk 2. He, from his descendants, converted V'lamdu Torah b'Yerushalayim, and they studied Torah in Jerusalem. Now, an interesting addition to this idea that the descendants of Sisra studied Torah. What's the end of Sisra? What happened with Sisra? Anybody know? Sisra was killed. Who was he killed by? A woman named Yael. We read about this in one of the Haftorahs. Yael, exactly, with a tent peg. Very good. Yael killed Sisra. How did she kill Sisra? So there's two stories of women. There's two stories. You're right. Two stories of women who killed generals of the opposed. Both of them use similar tactics of women who killed generals of the enemy camp. What was their approach? And I think, by the way, that you have stories like this even in contemporary history. So then what happened was they seduced these generals, and they seduced them into their tents. And then during the seduction, they killed them. So one is Yael, and the other is in the Hanukkah story, Yehudit. Those are two women who a similar pattern. So Sisra, the way we learn a lot of the laws of how to blow shofar from this episode. Sisra's mother was crying when Sisra didn't come home, and the sounds of those cries are what we replicate in the sounds of the shofar. So just a little tidbit of information. But the point is, Sisra was seduced by Yael. According to the Rab Nissen Gaon, he says like this. The Talmud also says, who was the descendant of Sisra? The great Rabbi Akiva. We know Rabbi Akiva was a descendant of converts. And he says that the great Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages ever, the Torah we have today is very much due to the fact that it was preserved by Rabbi Akiva. And he says that Rabbi Akiva was a descendant of Sisra, and goes further to say that in the Sefer Asar Mamaris it says that Rav Sisra was born to Yael. That day or that night that she killed him, they had relations. And it was those relations from which Yael conceived, and that conception is what led eventually to the birth of her great-great-grandchild. It's much earlier, but Rabbi Akiva was a descendant of that conception that took place between Yael and Sisra. Fine. So that's one example. Mibnei Banav shal Sanhedrin, the great wicked king Sanhedrin, who was the one who took all the 10 tribes into exile. As you may know, the 10 tribes went into exile well before the 2 tribes, 100 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. We have the 10 tribes going, and we don't know where they went until today. They're lost. I mean, today you already have the return of some of those tribes to Israel. So the 10 tribes who are, according to Danny, located in Detroit. The 10 tribes were exiled by Sanhedrin. His grandchildren, Limdu Torah Barabim, not only were righteous, but they taught Torah publicly. Umaninhu. And who are they? Who are the descendants of Sanhedrin? Shmaya ve'Avtalyon. The great sages Shmaya and Avtalyon, who were the teachers of whom? Hillel and Shammai. You look in Pirkei Avos, Hillel and Shammai, the great sage Hillel and Shammai Hillel and Shammai were students of Shmaya and Avtalyon. Shmaya and Avtalyon were descendants of Sisra, of Sanhedrin. And here we have the next one, which has to do with an upcoming holiday. Bibnei Banav shel Haman, from the grandsons. I don't know if Bnei Banav literally means grandsons. I mean the descendants of Haman. Lamdu Torah b'Bnei Brak. They taught Torah in Bnei Brak. And according to the in Yaakov, it even this says who it is. Umanu, who is that? Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas. Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas was a descendant of Haman. So Haman, who sought to destroy the Jewish people, he was an Amaleki. So the question is raised: how could Haman's descendants be Jewish? After all, Haman was an Amaleki. So the commentaries talk about that. Maybe it was his daughters, and that's why they were allowed in this discussion about how descendant of Amalek could be Jewish. Anyways, Haman's descendants taught Torah Bnei Brak. And then the Gemara says, and it happened also that the descendants of that wicked person, who is that wicked person? The Gemara doesn't even say his name. That's talking about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar apparently is the worst of the worst because he literally destroyed Jerusalem. He destroyed, it's like the equivalent to Nebuchadnezzar was the general who destroyed the second temple. That's Titus. They are the worst level. They literally destroyed God's holy home, killed many hundreds of thousands. His descendants too, Bikesh, wanted to convert. Bikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'achnisan. Here's an interesting thing the Gemara says. God wanted to allow them la'achnisan dachas kafei Ashchina. God was going to allow the descendants of Nebuchadnezzar to enter the covenant of Judaism. Amru malachi yashar savnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the angels of God said to God. Here's we have an interesting debate. God says if they're ready to convert and they're sincere, then let them in. And the angels couldn't handle that. The angels turned to God and says, Rebbeinu Shalom, Master of the universe, Misha Hekrev es Beisacha, the one who destroyed your house, V'saraf es Heichalecha, and burnt your holy place. You're going to let that person or their descendants enter the Jewish faith, and he brings a pasuk for the. So therefore, the words of the angels were successful, and they did not end up joining the Jewish people. The Nebuchadnezzar's descendants did not end up joining the Jewish people. Now the commentaries say, what's the difference between Nebuchadnezzar and the others? Nebuchadnezzar was wicked, so was Haman. Why is it Haman's grand descendants become teachers of Torah? Nebuchadnezzar, that the angels can't tolerate. What's the difference? So the answer is that despite, that's what they say, but in the different, not that Nebuchadnezzar succeeded, but rather that Haman, as wicked as Haman was, and he was, Haman represents the ultimate hatred of Jewish people. He just wants to kill them. But at the end of the day, God's name was strengthened through Haman. We have a holiday because of Haman. We get to eat and drink and dress up because of Haman. So Haman's the result of Haman's actions was a Kiddush Hashem. He didn't mean it, but the result of Haman's actions, Kiddush Hashem. The result of Sisera was also a Kiddush Hashem. He was killed, and it was a great victory of the Jewish people because of that. Even Nebuchadnezzar, even Sanhedrin, who brought the 10 tribes into exile, but he was also defeated when he tried to conquer the 2 tribes of Israel. So the other wicked people, at least their lives, Nebuzaradan. So that's a good question. But it doesn't say Nebuzaradan's descendants were, right? Well, how was it? Because he himself, what was the Kiddush Hashem there? No, he killed the people the Zechariah was killed by the Jewish people. The point is that Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed Jerusalem, the angel said there's no Kiddush Hashem, his only legacy is destruction of Judaism. His children can't be included in the Jewish faith. And apparently, the way the Gemara kind of leaves off is that the angels were victorious in that argument. And God said, okay, fine. But so this is several examples of the most wicked people. And yet their descendants gave birth to not only people who converted, but people who became Torah scholars and Torah teachers. We'll conclude the Gemara over here. But what's the positive takeaway from this? The positive takeaway from this is that Judaism is a very, very optimistic faith. It's a very optimistic faith. The fact that Torah says that even the most wicked of all people, their descendants may be righteous. Or even someone like Nebuchadnezzar, who's again represents wickedness. But the 4 steps, which he said, the 4 steps he took were recognized and rewarded for. It's a very profound message. And certainly for ourselves, we're decent people. We should never underestimate a good deed that is done, even by someone, we may come across a criminal. You may come across someone who's made all sorts of bad decisions in life. Don't discount the good that they do. Don't discount their holy choices. Don't discount their good moments, because chances are the person you meet is not nearly as terrible as some of the examples brought here in the Gemara. And yet we find merit either in their descendants or even merit in something that they did. And the demerits, the awful things that they do in life, doesn't discount, doesn't take away. We don't ignore the bad. We don't say the bad doesn't count. We recognize that I'm wrong, but doesn't take away from the righteous goodness that they do. And even a very horrible person has the capacity to do something righteous and to be recognized for that. And this obviously it's food for thought, but to think about. But I think that is the I think lasting message that this Gemara is meant to convey. All right, that will conclude. What's that?
Today's world is just the opposite, right?
I think we can close this way. All right, so I'm just going to say goodbye. Have a good evening, everyone who joined us virtually. Hopefully, we'll see you again next Thursday, and have a good Shabbos all.